this is a book that we've kind of called, I think it's Insights for PhD students and new interpretive and critical researchers. And we wanted to share some of the things that don't always get shared in resources on how to do a PhD or how you're supposed to do research. So we're kind of thinking about this as what's it like to do research that doesn't quite fit the other research that people around you might be doing. And this idea for the book kind of emerged out of my own experiences and I guess the stories that I was hearing from people around me about when I was doing my PhD, which was a couple of years ago now. But when I started, I was increasingly interested in interpretive and critical methods and how that might address my research question. And I looked at evidence and ethics in nudging in public policy. But it didn't really seem to align with the expectations of how I was supposed to do a thesis that I was reading about in these PhD books, and I was going to workshops and doing all the things that you diligently do when you start a PhD and read the how to do resources and things. And they had these expectations of doing a PhD, which was around, developing a research question and then finding your method and writing up your survey or your interview questions, going out for your fieldwork, and then doing a stage of analysis, and then doing a stage of writing up, and then you sort of deliver your thesis. And this wasn't really how I was approaching my research, and I didn't have either the words or the people around me at the time to understand what was happening. So this is sort of the way that we've developed the book, and about sharing experiences from really senior academics, also other PhD students, on what's it like to do a interpretive and critical research. And we're hoping the book will be really useful. So we go through in the book a range of different methods that you can use, sort of things like narrative analysis that you may be familiar with, ethnography and things, some other ones like arts-based approaches as well. But more so, we want to see it as a way of sharing others' experiences, normalizing some of the experiences that we feel when doing an interpretive and critical PhD, and that kind of stress or that kind of feeling like maybe we're doing something wrong because we're not doing it the same way as everyone else, and be a support for new researchers. And we've sort of pitched it at PhD students, but we think this also works for people who are maybe more experienced researchers and just coming across interpretive and critical methods for the first time. So what I'll do is just go through each of the chapters that we have, because I think it's useful to see the kind of things that people are talking about, and then some of the threads that we think are important and some questions before I'm going to hand it over to Helen. So Devorah now has very generously agreed to write the foreword for the book. And I think it's worth just reflecting that when she sort of agreed to do the project, she mentioned that the reason she normally doesn't do these kind of things, but the reason that she did it was because she was, I think, a little disheartened that people are still having these same experiences, that it's still a struggle to have, and you still have to defend interpretive and critical approaches. It can still feel like you're the only person doing these approaches, and it can still feel like you're up against another dominant approach. And so she's writing the foreword for us. And then Helen and I are writing the introduction, which is the background and what we're doing today. And then we have Pobsuk and Piapong, who are from the Chiang Mai University, the Critical Research School of Public Policy. And they talk about, they propose a framework for what it is to be a policy translator, and how we should use our voices as critical researchers to unearth silent voices, and to use our way of understanding and unearthing hidden narratives. And they look at, I don't know if people are familiar with Chiang Mai, which is a city in northern Thailand. It's kind of renowned at the moment. I'm in Thailand, so that's why I kind of work with them and know them. But they, it's kind of renowned at the moment, unfortunately, for having the worst air quality in the world, and does so every year, and has particular problems because of its geography and its location around sustainability and environment. So they looked at a 20-year plan for the city and tried to see where are the narratives that might be hidden and might be ignored by dominant elites, and how they can unearth them. Then Helen has written an excellent, fantastic chapter on emotions in interpretive and critical research, and she can talk further on this if later, but it's looking at how we feel emotions when we do interpretive and critical research. You know, we're it's about positionality and reflexivity. We are part of the research and it can unearth emotions in us and what we do with those, but also emotions as an analytical lens. So the study of emotions in our research projects as well. And then Stephen Griggs and David Howarth write a thing on moving in and out, a chapter, sorry, pre-coffee, moving in and out of the field. And they look at discourse logics and critical explanation. And they are sort of experts in critical research and write really reflexively and I think usefully on some of the things we don't always think about when doing our research, like the importance of field notes, the importance of turning up to interviews early so we can just get a sense of what's happening in the room. They argue for slow research, which isn't always possible in PhDs, but is really important to be thinking about as well. And then Harley has a chapter. I think Harley's in the room. Harley wave? I think I saw him earlier. And he has also written a really brilliant chapter on his experience doing document analysis and interviews in the Indonesian higher education system. And again, right, it's very, I think, powerfully and openly on some of the emotions that can be unearthed in doing interpretive and critical research, the kind of the stress you can feel when you have to be listening to interviews and what do you do if you don't get it right, and the need for flexibility. So I won't talk too much about your thesis, Harley, but if you want to talk about it, the flexibility you need during COVID and how that led to a different approach and how that can be quite powerful as well. Tamara writes on her experiences I love her chirotic meshwork, thesis making enacted in the selvage. And I had to look up probably almost all of those words when she first sent the chapter through. But it's such a fantastic chapter because she thinks of chirosis not in the linear way that we think of doing PhDs, you know, doing this, finding our research question and finding out our methods, but it's particular moments in time that have affected her PhD. And so she writes really, again, openly on those. Berit and Louise, who are in international relations, but also very powerful interpretive researchers, and look at research in Myanmar and, oh my goodness, Colombia, and some of the conflict resolution work that they've done there, as well as in South Sudan. And again, how they use arts-based approaches and they discuss those, but also how COVID has led to them rethinking how they approach their research, but also how this rethinking led to really points of insights and knowledge in their thesis. Then Sero writes about his experience on Indigenous land claims in Cambodia, and he again writes really wonderfully about his experience in doing ethnographic work, the impact of COVID, and also introduces decoloniality, which Helen and I picked up on as a really important thread in interpretive and critical research. So that's kind of what we have thought of as what it is to be an interpretive researcher and what it is to do interpretive research and more focused on field work. This section is more focused on the experience for PhD students in particular. Stephen Jafares writes a series of vignettes on overcooking the turkey, and he talks about overcooking the turkey and undercooking the turkey and serving raw turkey, and uses this as a great metaphor to think about our analysis. So when we have our data, once we've done our fieldwork, how do we make sure we're not over-analyzing so that voices still aren't represented, or under-analyzing, so all we do is have big quotes. And through that, he also talks about the role of supervisors in interpretive and critical research. So supervisors as being helpful and guiding research, but also supervisors as potentially being unhelpful, which I think is a really interesting perspective as well. So next, Helen and I write a conversation, what we call sort of navigating and negotiating supervision. And this is I guess, a more reflexive chapter on our experiences together of, you know, showing both sides of the coin. What is it to be a student and be supervised? And what is it to be a supervisor of that student? And we talk about different aspects, such as, you know, what it's like to hand in a draft and the kind of stress as a student you can feel for that, what it is to have a productive meeting and questioning the idea of productive. And what's it like to come into interpretive research and have to learn a language of interpretivism that might feel quite foreign. And then Sophie Yates and Janine O'Flynn, who's obviously the head of Crawford, have written about what it's like to examine interpretive and critical theses and pull out some threads on what makes good theses, what makes good interpretive theses, and as well as ideas for, so it's both for students and examiners. And then, so the guys and girls from Southampton Uni, so John Boswell, Jack Corbett, Mount Monash, Tamara Metz, and Rod Rhodes, reflect on their experiences teaching a spring school. So for the past, I think it was almost 10 years, they ran a spring school, which was for other interpretive and critical researchers. And they talk about how important that is to be able to share the craft of interpretive and critical research. So not just methods, but what are these experiences like, but also from the student's perspective to understand how important it is to be able to have a support network and be able to share some of their experiences that we've been talking about. And then finally, our conclusion, which is almost done, which is looking at as a career as an interpretive researcher. So we look at what it is to be, have a career as an interpretive and critical researcher in universities, but also outside of universities. So how might you bring an interpretive and critical lens to research that you're doing outside the academy, in think tanks or consultancies or government? And then also positionality, so how you talk about and think about this type of research as well. So that's the kind of the structure and the chapters that we talk about. And in the book, we've pulled out what we think of the kind of four main threads or themes in the book. And firstly, it's around the importance of field work and field sites to interpretive and critical research, the flexibility that is inherent, but is also a strength in the work that we do. And things around, understanding the messiness that can be in interpretive and critical research that doesn't necessarily fit the linear narratives of how research goes, how important that is to both reflect on and use, and is a source of strength in the research that we do. And these are things that more experienced researchers might know about and embrace, but I think when you're just starting, it can feel uncomfortable to have to be justifying and understanding and have the words for why this is important. So that was the kind of the first big theme that we saw. Secondly was emotions, and we had a chapter on emotions because we felt so strongly that it is really important in the work that we do, but it's also a thread throughout the different chapters as well. It can be the stress of doing interpretive and critical research and having to constantly defend the kind of work that you're doing, the exhaustion that can come from field work, the emotions that it can arise in the work that we're doing. So these are kind of a focus of that kind of thread. And then what we've called defining others who do. So how important it is to build networks and support systems with other critical and interpretive researchers or researchers that are doing similar work for you as points of catharsis, as points of collaboration, as emotional supports as well. And then finally on criticality, which we've sort of a thread again throughout the chapters, is the importance of being self-reflexive and critical in the work that we're doing, but also as a discipline. So as interpretive and critical researchers, how do we evolve to meet critiques such as decoloniality and decolonialism? They're the kind of themes that we've pulled out as important, and we're happy to continue discussing these. And we've left with just some sort of, questions around, and I think I'm probably more interested in it as well, in how what I've talked about resonates or does not for those in the room and online. Is these the kind of experiences that you're feeling or not? What might a successful experience of interpretive research be for a new researcher? What does support look like? In the book, we talk about the support that can come from supervision, from other students, from mentors, from online networks. And then are interpretive support groups needed? And whose responsibility is it to find these? Is it a supervisor? Is it an examiner? Not examiner. Is it mentors? Is it us as students or new researchers?
So can I just come in on maybe just I'd really love to know a little bit more about the navigating and negotiating chapter that you wrote together. What's the dialogue there between supervisor and supervising? If there's some way we can embarrass the two of you, I'd love to try and do that, but in a way that's pedagogically useful. So let's maybe start with a bit more of that, and then we'll generate some discussion. And for people online, Will and I will keep a watch for hands. So please, you're involved in this too, and Helen will leave you to handle the room. Thanks.
Colette, do you want to start?
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, thanks, Helen. I think so. It seemed like a really good opportunity to reflect on what it is like to be supervised and supervise in an interpretive and critical thesis, because I hadn't read anything like that when I was doing my PhD. And fortunately, I was confident enough in Helen and I's relationship that anything that was unearthed, we'd be able to work through in a very sort of productive way, which we were. And so we've kind of kept it as a conversation, and it opens with me talking about how I had come from a positivist kind of background. So I worked in applied and consulting research for sort of 10 years before I came. And so I naively thought going into a PhD would just be like running a big research project. I was like, yeah, I've done this before, it'll be fine, it's just a little bit longer. And how my mentality had to change around that. But also I had to learn to speak interpretive. And that's the kind of the metaphor that I've used in the PhD, is that I started reading these interpretive papers and they were really interesting to me, but I just didn't kind of understand the words. I was so far removed from interpretive and critical research. I didn't know what like constructivism was, and I didn't know what it meant to construct something. And it was so out of my realm of understanding that it took me a long time to learn to speak interpretive and understand these words and these terms and how to use them. And I felt that was made more difficult because I didn't have people around me other than Helen that was speaking the same language. So they were sort of speaking in variables and hypotheses and those sort of things, and not in the words that I was using. And so I talk about how that was a challenge. And I should say in this chapter, what we've tried to do is pick out things that we think are particular to interpretive and critical research, rather than just like in supervision in general. And then Helen has so I sort of write my section, and then Helen eloquently responds with her expertise on what it's like to supervise me, but also lots of other people that she's supervised over the years, and how this is a normal process. And I think I pulled out that was one of the things that for me was the most valuable in having Helen as my supervisor, is that she sort of I hate using the word normalize in interpretive and critical research, but she made this go, this is okay, this is what happens. Your feelings, your experiences are okay. And so we talk about that. And then I talk a bit more, Helen, you have to yell if I've missed anything here, around, I don't have it in front of me, around things like meetings. And so coming from a consulting background, I used to go into my meetings with Helen with this like agenda. And I had this agenda and I would like tick items off, and I'd be like, yeah, okay, I'm doing really well. And then if I wasn't ticking items off, I'd get really frustrated with myself. And we talk about how Helen gave me the space to go, actually, interpretive and critical research is slow research. It's reflexive, it's thinking, it's not about ticking things off. And so making sure I had the space to do that. And then we also talk about what it is to learn to write. I call it writing interpretively. I'm sure there's a much better term for it, but it's about how having the confidence in your work when you're doing interpretive work, because you're not validating it. It's not statistics that can be rerun. It's not sampling frames that can be checked by other people. It's about learning to acknowledge your own positionality, but that positionality is valid and your analysis is valid. So like, for example, taking out, sorry guys, finding like things like, I used to use like, this may be, perhaps this is, and having to go through and taking all these out of my work, and how Helen came through and was very kind to me in my work around how to do this in the best way without destroying my self-confidence. And then we also talk about things like when there was feedback that was quite confronting. And I talk about how I ate a lot of chocolate because I was just like, oh my God, I can't do this. What am I thinking? And how Helen explained that this is a normal process. Everybody goes through this with their theses. And at some point you will get feedback that feels harsh, but you will move through it and you will have a better thesis. And so Helen draws on her many, many years experience as a supervisor and her expertise in interpretive work. And I talk about my sort of quite fresh experiences still on doing, on being supervised. And we hope that that can be useful for others in understanding what we call it kind of navigating, because you're supposed to navigate this one route and it doesn't always feel like that's the right route, but also it's a negotiation. So there's two people with different perspectives that come into a PhD supervisory relationship, and you have to think about the different hats they're wearing and what they both might need out of the relationship. Helen?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and I suppose the thing to say, the only other thing to say about that, in terms of how we structured it, what we thought would be most useful would be if, Colette started with whatever it was, and so the chapter itself evolved as a negotiation, as a conversation, but it was always led by Colette as the supervisee, because we felt that was, in terms of students and early career researchers, that would probably resonate more effectively than some aged supervisor kind of passing on wisdom. And it was, so pedagogically we hope it's helpful, because we hope that what we've lit on are the things like, how do you learn to think and speak and write interpretively, which is not obvious. And it's also, I think it's not easy. And it's something that you don't just, one day you think, oh yes, this is who I am. Now I'm fluent. You have to keep working at it. And it's something that you take through your career. You constantly have to keep working at it. So again, I think what we're trying to do with this chapter is to both have it be student-led, but also really reflect on what are the things that you as an interpretive or critical researcher are going to come across that maybe some of your colleagues won't come across. And to represent those so that you can see both that they are, just perfectly ordinary as far as doing interpretive and critical work is concerned, but also that they are valid, that they are important, and they're important in helping you become an interpretive researcher. So that's why we did it as a dialogue.
We have a hand up and a question in the chat online, so maybe we'll take the hand up first, and then we'll flip to the room and see where we go from there. So Daniel, would you like to ask?
Thank you. As some of you know, I'm not an interpretivist. I am a quantist, but I've had lots of chats with April and have been keen to try and come along and better understand. And at a number of conferences, I've been given advice about how to better explain my work to interpretivists. And that's been really helpful for me, because it's also helped me think about where interpretivist ideas fit within my own research, where I'm naturally inclined to interpretivist approaches. And I wonder if there's anywhere in the book that helps interpretivists reach out to the other side, because especially at ANU, I do feel there's quite a gap, geographic as well as intellectual. And so, especially at the PhD level, helping both sides explain and listen. Yeah.
It's a great question, Daniel. I'm going to answer that, and the short answer is no. And the reason for that is there's a longer answer, which is more nuanced. But our concern with this book was to take a group of researchers who, although do incredibly valuable work, remain marginal and not recognized sufficiently in the academy, in our institutions. And so our focus is on them. The slightly more nuanced answer is that one of the things we do in the book, when we're talking about, both Colette and I have worked in industry, is how do you demonstrate the value of this work in an environment where that work is completely invisible, which, where would the work, Daniel, the kind of quantitative work that you do, would be more of the norm. And so that's where the book does try, so certainly in the final chapter, we try to talk about the ways in which it is possible for interpretivists to be really important and valuable assets to organizations. And that does require that kind of relational activity, communication, and so on and so on. But our starting point is that it is not the job of interpretivists to explain themselves to anybody else. And that is fundamentally important. So, yes, I hope there will be things that were of value, Daniel, in the book, but our focus is on, how we enable interpretivists and critical researchers to really claim the space that is theirs and have confidence that the work that you are all doing is not just valuable intellectually, which is critically important, but also has value out there practically in the organizations that you'll be working for.
Thank you.
Kathy from PSC. I'm actually particularly interested on a book chapter about Don't Overcook the Turkey. It's very interesting because when I read some interpretative work, I think that's the biggest challenge, especially for young or like early researchers to even acknowledge or maybe just to realize that we're doing it overly or maybe under analyzing it. So can you maybe elaborate more on that? Like what is inside the chapter, and maybe it's interesting to talk this.
Yeah. So Stephen Jeffers, who wrote this chapter, was really interested in what happens when interpretivists come to analysis, and so the chapter is, as Colette says, a series of vignettes. They're sort of amalgams of different student experiences, but really what he's trying to do is to say, when we think about being interpretivists and doing that analytical work, how do we have the confidence that both we can identify and explore the patterns that we're seeing in the data, but also where we have some guardrails so that we know that we're not coming to something either over determining what we think we're going to find, because even though we're interpretivists and we're reflexive, there is always the danger that you will latch on in your mind to a particular idea, or a particular frame, or a particular interpretation. So how do we make sure that we're not over determining what we're going to find, but that we still have the confidence, because we have the tools to recognize patterns in the data, and that can be done. Stephen is somebody who's used Q methodology quite extensively, so this is something that he has lots of experience doing, using a variety of methods, and he's very good on the way in which some of those methods can in themselves become a part of the over-determining, that you rely too much on the machine that spits out a series of factors. So it's constantly having that skepticism about how you're approaching your analysis, so that you can build up the stories, the narratives, in a way that are true to the data, without over-determining, but also without, as Colette was pointing out, without being so cautious and so modest in your approach that actually what you're trying to do is just let the data speak for itself. The point about being an interpreter, or one of the points, is that you are doing the interpreting, you're identifying the patterns. And so his chapter takes you through a range of ways in which you can overcook it, undercook it, eat it raw. Forget the thermometer. I can't remember what the other one was, but yeah, it's a really great chapter and really, really helpful. And one of the other things he does is, because his work is on the role of AI in public service provision. So one of the other things he does is to talk about how with these new AI tools that can both help but also challenge interpretativists. So yeah, there's some really good stuff here. Yeah. Yeah.
You said that I'm Tony, I'm a visiting fellow at PhD, but also a PhD candidate. So one of the emerging themes was kind of, how interpretism evolves to meet the critiques of decolonialization. Could you please explain a little bit about the findings?
Well, we don't have any findings per se. I mean, so Sarah, as Colette was saying, who is still doing his PhD and spending time in the field in Cambodia, and also I think Britt and Louise as well. Where we've arrived at, which is not particularly revelatory at all, but I think is the place where, if interpretivism is to further develop where we are as a subdiscipline, whatever we want to call it, is to really think about how do we engage with critiques of interpretivism as part of a particular expression of pedagogy and research. And that's where the challenges of decolonialism come in, I think, quite profoundly. And I think there's a risk, and there'll be other people in this room who I am sure know more about this than I do, but I think where we are is a risk that we assume that as critical and interpretive scholars, we are necessarily in sync with the challenges of decolonialism, and of course we aren't. And so I think there's an opportunity for all of us to really be thinking hard about what does this mean for interpretive work, what does it mean for critical work, and how do we engage in a way that's constructive with critiques of us. And one of the journals that Stephen Griggs, who again is one of our other authors, one of the journals he founded, Critical Policy Studies, is a great place for some of those conversations. But if you look back at the journal itself, there are criticisms that could be made of the ways in which we think we do interpretive work that may itself be replicating things that disguise power relations and other things. So we don't have any answers, but we think that that's a really important area, and particularly new PhD students, people who are in the thick of it now. You have an opportunity to really get into what that means and how we should be doing it. But yeah, we're definitely not. We're all learning in that area. So sorry, I don't have an answer. Would you want to add anything to that, Colette?
No, you're pretty thorough, Helen. Thank you. But I think I echo everything Helen says. And think it is. I increasingly work in decoloniality, and I think there's a lot of alignment in terms of positionality and reflexivity. There's questions about being dominated by voices from the global north, extractive data practices in the global south, and so on. But I think what Helen says about that we can feel, because we're working and constantly defending ourselves and working opposite dominant ontologies and epistemologies and approaches, that we need to still make space for criticality of our own approaches as well, and making sure that we do that.
And I think one of the good things in the book, that what some of the authors have done, because they're experiencing these things themselves, is they are actually reflecting in the process of writing of their experience of identifying as interpretive and critical researchers, but then feeling this unease that what they are, how they are framing things, or how they're being encouraged to frame things is not entirely in sync with where they think they should be studying and how they should be studying. So actually, I think that some of the answers that you might be looking for are actually in the chapters.
There's a question in the chat which I've been holding on to. If there's no one in the room, I'll put it up. It's a topical question, but quite a difficult one, from Subrata. What are the things a researcher should keep in mind about their positionality when analyzing the narratives of victims of gender-based violence in interpretative research?
That's a great question. So I think I'm not sure that there's anything I would say necessarily that start again. I think positionality is absolutely key, and I think if you are able and you've done the work and you understand your own positionality, then it shouldn't really matter what it is you are researching. So for me, I think there's something about particularly the power relations that are inherent in my positionality, for example, that whatever I'm studying, I need to be very conscious of that and what that means for how I'm perceived, how I'm experienced, how I perceive others. So I absolutely recognize that people are working, as Louise and Barrett are, as surrogates, in areas that are incredibly challenging, you know, conflict, extractive resource extraction, gender-based violence is absolutely one of those. I suppose I would just be cautious about saying that to be a good interpretivist, there is something else one should be aware of in that circumstance. Because for me to be a good interpretivist, you should be aware of all of those things, whatever it is you're studying. I think one of the things that would absolutely happen, though, in that context, is that the emotional burden of working in that area as a researcher, but also as somebody who is going to participate in the research, I think would take a huge toll. So for me, I suppose I'd be thinking more about what is that kind of research doing to researchers, but also the people who agree to participate in the research in terms of the emotional burden and how you think about that and reflect on that in the work. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
I think brother.
But it is a great question. And again, it is something that, you know, these are things which are, as interpreters and critical scholars, you know, there is it's a really big responsibility to work through those things and to think about those things. You know, we don't come to research as, you know, dispassionate, independent, external observers. You know, we're in the world, and so a lot of what happens, certainly in supervision, in my experience, is building up both the awareness and the skills to be able to stand oneself, but also one's position in the world, but also to develop those skills of reflexivity. And those things take time, and again, they're very different from the kinds of things you might be doing in other research activities, but they are really, well, crucial to have those, and you can't hide it.
Yes.
Thanks, Helen. Could you say a bit more about writing interpretively? You've kind of mentioned self-reflexivity and positionality, and maybe there's more to say about that, but I was wondering if form could be something you could expand on, and how much, in terms of thinking about playing with form, is possible in the confines of the thesis.
Sounds like the
No, please go ahead. No, I just love this because it hits on a few. It hits on if I understand, like, are you talking like form and structure in writing the thesis as well as kind of how you write? Because that hits on some of the things we looked in the supervision chapter, but also in the examination chapter as well, about what are the expectations of examiners that you have to meet, as well as being able to be true to your research and writing, you know, in the form that sits at best. So that's why I was like, that's a really cracker of a question that I'll let Helen answer.
So we take the second. I mean, are you interested in the actual the form of the thesis in as well as the how you write it? Is that part of your?
Yes, I was thinking about some interpretivist work in book form, which plays with form a bit, you know, like vignettes or other things, but then thinking about what is possible with a thesis.
Yeah, it's a great look. It's an absolutely great question, and it's where, you know, as supervisors, you have to be pragmatic. I remember a really excellent student of mine who, you know, is just one of those people who is just so far out there, you know, doing extraordinary stuff. And she wrote her thesis in a particular way, which was just terrific. But we got the examiners wrong, and they hated it, absolutely hated it. And so that was a really difficult experience for her, and a really difficult experience for me, because I was the person responsible for agreeing which examiners we should have, and that's not fair. We didn't get them all wrong, but we got one of them very badly wrong, and that, combined with the others' legitimate questions, you know, made a lot of extra work, which to my mind was what that did to her when she left academia, and was quite disillusioned, and in a way, and which I completely understand. But that's one of the things, and Tamara's chapter in the book really deals with this, because Tamara's chapter and her thesis, indeed, I know the examiners of her thesis, you know, they were people who were really prepared to go beyond and to see what was not a conventional thesis. But even that unconventional thesis was completely pulled back compared to how the playing with form that she had wanted. And so, and in Janine's chapter on examination, as Colette says, you know, one of the things it reflects on is you know, what is it that you can and should, as a supervisor, be saying to students, which is, keep this for the book, keep this for when you've got the thesis. The thesis is that, especially now, you know, when you have time limits and everything else, the thesis is, you know, something that, yes, you can perhaps move around the edges, and good examiners, and again, this is, you know, where you do need supervisors to really find who the right examiners. Good examiners will allow for vignettes and for certain experimentation, but fundamentally they need to be convinced that, you know, the thing does everything it needs to. And I'd be interested in April and Nick's reflections on this, but for me, when I examine a thesis, I know within the first 2 or 3 pages whether this is going to work or not. And that's not necessarily about form, but it is, to come to your prior point, it is about having the confidence when you're writing to really embody the fact that you are an interpretive researcher. And so the language that you use, you know, it's not using language to obscure your lack of confidence, but it's having the confidence to write in an interpretive way that reveals to the examiner that you do know what you're talking about and that you have done the work. But yeah, there is still there is still a balancing act. And so the adventurous stuff, yeah, keep it.
Sometimes you get good advice on how to do that. At the point you move towards the,
Yes, that's true.
like examiners giving suggestions on being more adventurous in the book.
Yeah.
I think that, can I ask about a strategic question of sorts? Did anyone in the book deal with the question of supervisors who advise their supervisees not to use interpretive methods or work in interpretive methodologies because you won't get a job? Or this issue around, enough said, please.
Yeah, it kind of that comes through, I think, throughout in different parts of the so we don't. It's not something I mean, in a way, it's to go back to Daniel's question, it's kind of one of the starting points of the book is that, so many of our students have had that experience. Either a supervisor saying to them, yeah, nobody's going to be interested in this, you won't have a career. Or, having a supervisor that is supportive, but then doing a program of research training where the research trainers look at you and say, what are you doing this for? I mean, Harley can absolutely talk to that. So yeah, we do reflect on that. And one of the things we hope the book does, and I'm, well, we're both, living proof, but also Nick, April are living proof that you can indeed be an interpretivist and have a career. Both inside the academy and outside. So one of the things we hope that the book does is to say you can overcome these, but perhaps that requires some of the other things we talk about in the book, which is, how do you build up a network? How do you find the other resources, of which we hope this book is going to be one, that is going to enable you to have the confidence that this is something that will lead to a career. So yeah, but yeah, it comes on. I mean, and I don't think there's a single author in the book, to be honest, who won't have had that experience.
Yeah, actually, it's really a follow up because for me, I've never got the idea of you cannot get a career. But as an international student, I did got the information that it means decrease the likelihood of getting a scholarship, which yeah, not at the ANU, by the way. In other places.
Good grief.
Yeah, so I just wondering from a pragmatic perspective, does this mean I should be how should I put it? Not just interpretivist per se, it also includes some other, critical theories, not positivist methods in general. Does this mean I should be, let's say, willing to make some compromises?
That's a decision you have to make. That is a decision for you. I mean, there are absolutely people who we reference in the emotions chapter. Actually, we reference some work from somebody who would not describe themselves as an interpretivist. They're a researcher in a particular field. They use all sorts of methods and approaches. And there are a bunch of people who see these things as things you just put on. Today I'm going to put on a coat of interpretivism. Tomorrow I'll put on a coat of positivism. So there are some people who make that claim and have are very, very successful. I suppose as a kind of fully signed up interpretivist, I find that very hard because for me it's not something that you can just put on and take off. But then I think there's a difference. There's a difference between declaring yourself to be interpretivist and critical and saying that because that's about how you approach the world and the questions that you're interested in. But you can also be a fully, and Colette's a great example of this. She's an incredibly skilled researcher in all sorts of things, all sorts of methods, and she can talk the language of variables and statistical deviation and all that stuff, and that's great. So it doesn't mean that you have to limit yourself in terms of the methods that you use, but I think you need to make a decision for yourself about what kind of questions do you want to ask and how do you want to find the answers to those questions.
wonder if Colette has any further remarks on that before we close. We're right at the top of the hour.
I think, yeah, absolutely. Helen's absolutely right. And I think we talk about this in the conclusion a little bit. It's about also how you want to position yourself, and that you can do interpretive and critical research and not necessarily have to be a full-blown flag-wearing sort of interpretivist and critical researcher. And you can just, when we talked about this in the workshop, we had another one of our colleagues, Sarah Ball, who's doing great interpretive and critical research in a space that maybe isn't that open. So she just gets on with it and does it, and doesn't like feel the, like in her particular situation, that's what works for her. And so I think there's lots of different ways when we talk about positionality and career, is it's about positioning yourself as well, and how you want to position yourself as a researcher. What's a narrative you want to tell in the work that you're doing? Because you can be using, you know, interesting and engaging methodologies and using pragmatic and research that's making impact, and not necessarily have to talk about critical research, or you may want to center that in the work that you do. And like Helen said, I think that's a choice that people make, and it might change depending on where you are and what you're doing, but I think it's something to be sort of aware of as we do our research as well.
Closing remarks.
Oh, I'm just really pleased there's so many. I think it's wonderful.
Yep, thanks everyone for coming along.